morning, everybody. How is everybody doing today? Awesome. Thank you. I was going to say, you can't answer. It's so loud. So I was actually honestly expecting it to be a lot less because it's Labor Day weekend, but you guys did it. You made it. We're so glad you are here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pastor Nathan. I'm the online pastor here at Discovery, and Pastor Rick had asked me to preach this week. I think next week we are starting a brand new series. It's going to be excellent. I can't wait for that. But today I thought, as I was kind of thinking about, what am I going to talk about? The same thing I do every single time. And here's the thing I was wondering. I was thinking about a book I was just reading recently. And it wasn't actually about the book itself, because honestly, the book wasn't that great. But the way I found out about this book was kind of a crazy thing. This is kind of a newer way maybe you hear about books. It was on TikTok. I know, it's kind of crazy. TikTok, you don't normally think of like education and reading and things like that. But there's this whole separate subsection of TikTok that they call book talk, which is kind of fun. And I just kept seeing this book. Like, people were really excited about this book. And so finally I was like, all right, I don't know if I want to buy this book, but I'll at least check it out from the library. I got a copy from the library, and this was really funny. I've never seen this. Inside the printed book, on the first page, normally in books they'll put like reviews and like, here's what all the different critics are saying about this book and how great it is. This book actually had a bunch of reviews, and it said from Book Talk. I was like, this is the first time I've ever seen TikTok reviews like in text referenced in a written book. It was really strange. But I read this book, and like I said, it wasn't that great. But what struck me about it was everybody was talking about how great this book was, how much they loved it. And I do the same thing with movies or books or things that I'm really excited about. I love to tell other people about it when I get really excited about it. It just kind of happens. I'll start saying, hey, did you see this movie? Like, if it really struck me, I'll tell a lot of people about it. And as I was thinking about just getting excited about talking about things, I thought about my son, Adam. My son, Adam, is 11 years old, and right now what he really loves more than anything else is called Prime. Not Amazon Prime. I don't know if you've heard about this, but Prime, I don't know, there's energy drink, and then there's just like a rehydration drink. It's like Gatorade, but it's called Prime, and all the kids are like, oh, it's Prime, it's excited. And my son is really excited about this. Like, he'll come and he'll say, hey, I saw this thing that they might have this new flavor, and can we go to the vitamin store? Because I think I saw on YouTube that they have it in stock there. Let's go. And like, he gets so excited about trying to get every single flavor of it. He's like, I want to try them all. They're really exciting. It's something that he loves. It's something that he cares about. And because of that, he starts to tell other people all about it. Well, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? What does that really matter? And so today what we're actually going to be talking about is worship. Now, I know when I say worship, we immediately think of what we just did. We think of the couple of songs that we sing before the sermon, and that's definitely a part of that, and we're definitely going to spend some time talking about that. But worship is so much bigger than that. Worship is what we do when we're excited about something. We are putting something in the center of our lives, and then we tell other people about it. And so that's what I want to talk about today. What is worship? So let's pray as we get started. God, we thank you for this opportunity that we can meet every Sunday morning, that we can learn from your word, that we can spend time together as a community, that we can spend time singing and learning. Just be with us this morning. In your name, amen. So when we talk about worship, like I said, it covers more than just music. And while we'll talk about some of the music, I wanted to talk about the bigger picture first. And so if you turn to Romans 12, if you've got a Bible with you, you can turn to it there. It's up on the screen. And if you're using the Bible app, all the notes are in there as well. So if you're digital on your phone, just click Events, click Discovery Fellowship, and you should see all of this right there. But Paul writes, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. What does Paul tell us here that worship is? He says, sacrifice. Your bodies, presenting yourselves as a living sacrifice to God. That is the spiritual service of worship. And so what that means is it's more than just music. It's more than just singing. It's how you live your life. Your life as a sacrifice to God is how we worship. It happens every day of the week. It happens in all areas of our lives. And so that's the big definition. It's kind of the posture of your heart. What are you putting at the center? Because here's the thing, everybody is going to worship something. We all have something that we love, that we care about, and that we're excited to tell other people about. But for us as a Christian, us as a follower of Jesus, that thing needs to be Him. That needs to be God. That needs to be the center of our life that we're just overflowing with joy to tell other people about. Another definition of worship is from Wayne Grudem. Wayne Grudem is a theologian. He's written a lot of systematic theologies. He writes this. He says, worship is the activity of glorifying God in His presence with our voices and our hearts. So that's pretty big right there. Notice the first thing he says, it's an activity of glorifying God. We worship, it's not just about knowing who God is. It's not just about memorizing a lot from the Bible. It's not about a lot of head knowledge. But it's an activity that flows out of that. And it's about God. It's not about us, but it's about glorifying God in His presence and with our voices and with our hearts. And so we're going to take a little bit of a zoom in, and we're going to talk about some of the things worship can be. And as we all just kind of saw, worship can be musical, right? Definitely, it's not that worship is never a musical part. Even though it's so much more than just music, music is a big part of worship. And so you might be wondering, like, well, why music? Like, why did God build us to use music as a way to worship God? Like, why build music in as such a big thing? And I think it's really important to remember how important music can be. And one way we can demonstrate this, and you can find a lot of clips like this online, but I brought a clip today from a movie. And when you watch this clip, you're going to see exactly how important music can be, because music can change the tone, music can change the way we feel, music can convey a lot without any words. And so this clip I'm going to show you, it's from one of my favorite movies. It's from Return of the Jedi. It's a Star Wars movie. I love it. And it's going to start with the music that's originally in this scene. This is the music that the movie originally had, and you're going to feel an emotional way about it because that's what the music is trying to get to tell you. But about halfway through this scene, the music's going to change. The music is going to be something that was not in the original scene. It's going to be something completely different. And just see for a second how much it changes the tone of what you're watching. Check it out.
Inform the commander that Lord Vader's shuttle has arrived. Sir.
It definitely changes the tone of the scene, right? Music has this amazing ability, without any words being said, to just affect us in a way that we might not expect. And that's what I think is one of the reasons that God has used music so much, because it engages not just our heads, but our hearts. It gets our emotions connected. And God made us with both, right? We know a lot, we learn a lot, we study our Bibles, we are intellectual beings, but we also have emotions and we feel things. Look in the Bible, at the largest book we have in the Bible is a collection of songs, and how much of it is intended to convey emotion. As I was reading about the way that emotion affects us, especially when it comes to worshiping God, I found a quote by Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was a famous preacher in the 1800s. He wrote a very famous sermon that you might have heard of. It's called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It's kind of a fire and brimstone message. But he was talking about why did God use music? And he said this, he says that the duty of singing praise to God seems to be given wholly to excite and express religious affections. There is no other reason why we should express ourselves to God in verse rather than prose and with music, except that these things have a tendency to move our affections. You see, when you put music to something, it becomes not just about the head, but it gets the heart involved as well. The whole of your being in worshiping God when you incorporate music into the worship. But in addition, music helps us to remember things. I don't know about you. I can still remember songs I sang when I was a kid at church. I can't necessarily remember every sermon that was ever preached, but I can remember songs that I sang as a kid. And it's not just in a church service. Like, songs help us remember. That's why kids, we sing the ABCs, right? Now you know the ABCs because you just learned them in song. In fact, the other day, it was kind of coincidental. I was in a meeting here with Matt and I think Mickey, and we were talking about how funny it was that you could sing Amazing Grace to the tune of Gilligan's Island. Like, you can try that sometime in your head. It fits perfectly. Amazing Grace to Gilligan's Island. And that made me think, back in high school, I learned, while studying poetry, Emily Dickinson, most of her poems can also be sung to Gilligan's Island. And in that moment, last week, I hadn't thought about this in 20-something years since I've been in high school, but I was able to remember this poem in its entirety by singing it in my head to the tune of Gilligan's Island. It's kind of crazy the way that music does that. And this isn't a new thing. This isn't something that we're just now figuring out. If you go to the book of Deuteronomy, God tells this to Moses. He says, "Now then, write this song for yourselves and teach it to the sons of Israel. Put it on their lips so that this song may be a witness for me against the sons of Israel. For when I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to their fathers, and they eat and are satisfied and become prosperous, then they will turn to other gods and serve them and spurn me and break my covenant. Then it will come about, when many evils and troubles find them, that this song will testify before them as a witness, for it shall not be forgotten from the mouth of their descendants. For I know their inclination, which they are developing today, before I bring them into the land which I swore." So Moses wrote down this song on the same day and taught it to the sons of Israel. God knew that people have a tendency to forget things, that we have a tendency to go our own way, that we forget what God has done to us. And so he told Moses, look, write this down as a song so that you remember, so that when things go badly, you're going to be able to look back at this song and remember everything that I taught you. So music, God, I think, uses because it helps us learn, it helps us to remember, it helps it stick in our heads, it engages our emotion. And so one of the things that I feel like always comes up when we're talking about worship in a musical sense is repetition. Because I hear this a lot. People will say, that song had too much repetition. We repeated ourselves too many times. And I think if we think back to the last point, we're going to see the answer to maybe why repetition sometimes is helpful. Because we're trying to remember it, we're trying to learn it, and we need sometimes to be told over and over again. Think about it. If you have kids, when they were little, how many times did you have to tell them the same thing over and over again? Like, repetition is going to be sometimes necessary to help it get into our minds. And we see repetition in song even in the Bible. This is, again, not a new phenomenon. Repetition is actually used quite often. If you were to look at Psalm 136, I'm not going to read the whole thing today, but this is the whole psalm, and you can see every other line actually repeats itself. And it keeps going for this entire psalm, and what we see is that this was most likely a song that they would sing in Israel, where the leader would sing the first line, and the congregation would sing back, "His love endures forever." And in fact, over the course of this song, that's the only thing that the congregation sings. They just get to sing this one line over and over and over. And so actually by the end of that psalm, they end up singing this 26 times. They sing that same one phrase 26 times. I don't think we've ever done a song where we just sang a phrase 26 times, but that was a biblical song that you could sing. And so when we see repetition in songs now, we can remember the repetition in songs even biblically. In the book of Revelation, we see that the 4 living creatures had 6 wings. They were covered with eyes all around, even under its wings, day and night. They never stopped saying or singing, and we've sung this song as well. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And so the next time, if we sing a song and it feels like it's a little repetitious, instead of thinking about the repetition of it, ask the question of why. What is it that we're repeating? Is there something in that repetition that we need to learn, that we need to remember, that we need to put in so deep into our brains and our hearts that we never forget? And just thinking about music as a way of worshiping, I was looking at even external to the church sources. We see that music has always been a big part of the Christian church. I was reading a letter from a guy named Pliny the Younger. He was a governor in ancient Rome, and he was writing to the emperor, and he was confused about what to do with these Christians. There was Christians all springing up. This was the beginning of the 2nd century, into the 1st century time period, and the Christians were just coming everywhere, and he didn't quite know what to do with them. And so it's kind of cool because we get a description of what the early church was like from a non-Christian source, which we don't see often. And this is what he wrote. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error, that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse or return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again and partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. I just find this so funny because here's this guy, he's like, I keep torturing these Christians and I keep arresting them and it's just weird. Like, here's what they're doing. This is what is so bad. They get together once a week in a big group. They sing a song to Jesus. They have some fellowship. They all promise to try to be better people. And then they eat lunch. And like, should I keep torturing them? What do I do? It's kind of a weird scenario, but it's so interesting because even from the outside world, this is what they saw when they saw the church. They saw people getting together, singing, and fellowshipping together. So what else can worship be? Worship can be praise, which you might think, well, it's not the same thing as musical, and it can be. Again, we praise God through music, but it's more about the posture of our heart and even sometimes the posture of ourselves. It's telling God how good he is and all the good things we've gotten, that we've learned from him and that he's done for us. And while I don't have a lot of time to get into it today, if you want to look more at this, actually my wife Alexis, our current worship leader, has written quite a bit on our website that talks about some of these things, the postures of praise that we see throughout the Bible, not just how our heart is, but sometimes, hands up, on our knees, shouting for joy, like all of these biblical things we see. I mean, look at what happened when David worshiped him when the ark came back. He danced so much his clothes came off. I'm not suggesting that for our corporate worship. Please don't. If you're going to dance, make sure your pants are buttoned. But it's okay to express ourselves in praise to God. Worship can be prayer. It can be taking time throughout your week to pray to God, not just for things you need, but for communication, telling God how good he is. Worship can be something that we do by ourselves when you're at home. Again, it can be Bible study. It can be watching a sermon. It can be spending time with other Christians. It can be spending time with people who don't know God yet and telling them about him. It can be something that you do by yourselves or in your community. What we see here on a Sunday morning and what you see throughout the entirety of the week. But as we look at that and we look at all these different things that worship can be, something that often comes up are preferences. Because preferences are like belly buttons. Everybody has one. And so what do we do with that? How do we all have different preferences and yet come together in a unified way? Because we all do. And think about this. The church in America is just a smaller part of the church worldwide. You want to think we've got a diversity of preferences here. We have a diversity of preferences in this room. Look at how the entire world is. Look at the way they sing and they praise in Africa versus Asia versus Europe versus America. There is a lot of difference in our churches. And I think our solution is sometimes be divide based off that. Get into different groups that are all going to be in the same preferences that you have and avoid the ones that are a little bit different. But I think we see something different biblically. Paul tells us in Philippians to not look out for our own personal interests, but for the interests of others. And Jesus, when he talks about the church, is that it should be unified. That doesn't mean it looks the same everywhere, but actually it means that we set aside our own personal preferences to come together as this big, diverse group of different cultures and ideas and ages and people, all together worshiping the same God. See, that's what unites us. And Jesus says we're going to have a supernatural unity that looks different than anything the world can have. And so when I think about different preferences and I think about how that can be so divisive, I think, how much better would it be for us to, in spite of our differences, come together and say, this might not be the thing that I like, but I know it's helpful for this person, and I'm going to worship alongside with them. And as you know, what we do here at Discovery is really try to build in that diversity, that big gap of our smorgasbord of like ideas and preferences and song types and song selection, like volume, lighting, like all these different things that can be preferences. We kind of don't try to make everybody happy, but we kind of showcase the diversity that our church can look like. And so my question is, how do you act when your preferences are not met? How do you respond when you don't get what you want? Is it with the supernatural humility and unity that Jesus said the church would exemplify? Or do we just kind of fuss about it and maybe go home? Right? Like sometimes we do, it's so funny, like, again, thinking back on the musical side of it, sometimes it'll be, well, that was too many new songs, or that wasn't enough new songs, or it was too many hymns, or it wasn't enough hymns, or, you know, there's always a different preference. And I think it's so important that we just can stop focusing on those little things. Stop focusing on this new song that you don't know, and instead we focus on a God that we need to know better. So let's jump to a big section that I wanted to kind of hit on today. This was kind of the intro. We're going to be here about 4 hours, don't worry. I'm just kidding, we're not going to be here 4 hours. But let's turn to John, because I think this passage kind of summarizes and encapsulates of what we wanted to say. And so in this story, we know that Jesus is at a well in Samaria, and he's talking to a woman at the well. His disciples have gone, and she starts talking to him. She's surprised because he's talking to her. He tells her some things about her life that he couldn't have possibly known, and she's kind of amazed at this point. And so we're going to pick up the story right here. She says, "Sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and yet you Jews say Jerusalem is the place where one must worship." And Jesus said to her, "Believe me, woman, that a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. But a time is coming, and even now has arrived, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ, and when that one comes, he will declare all things to us." And Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one speaking to you." So I think there's 3 big things we can pull out of this section as it applies to this topic of worshiping God all around. The first one is I think it's really easy to argue over secondary issues. Look back at the first part of this. She says, "Our fathers worshiped on the mountain, and yet you Jews say that Jerusalem is a place where one must worship." She was getting hung up on where you can worship God. She was saying, do I have to worship here or do you have to worship there? Kind of a secondary issue. One that doesn't ultimately matter because where you are doesn't affect how you can worship God. And so I think again about what are some of the secondary issues that can keep us from worshiping. We talked about musical things, but it's not just a music preference that can keep us from worshiping. Maybe it's how do we interpret creation? How do we interpret the end times? How do we take specific tertiary issues? How much lighting is allowed on a stage in a service? What day of the week should you meet? How big should your church be? Like, these are all secondary things that we can get so caught up with that it'll prevent us from worshiping God how we need to. The second thing that pops out of this passage to me is that true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. Jesus says, a time is coming and even now has arrived when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. So he's saying this in response to our first question, right, about what the appropriate location of worship needs to be. And he says, look, it's not about location, it's about worshiping in spirit and in truth. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, spirit means that primarily worship is a spiritual thing. It's not about the externalities of it. It's about where your heart is. And the truth is about who we're worshiping, the truth of who God is and what he has done for us. So what we see, Jesus is saying that spirit and truth, it's that same idea. It's your head and your heart combined in this way of worshiping God that's not as much focused on what's external, but where your heart is and who it is that you're worshiping. So we've got to know who God is. We've got to know accurately what he says about himself in his word. And then we've got to worship him with everything in our heart. The other thing that really stands out in this passage is that it tells us that these are the people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. We can skip over that statement kind of easily sometimes, I think, but it's kind of an incredible thought that in almost pretty much every other religious belief in the world, it's all about how do you get to God? How do you find your way to God? But Jesus tells us something amazing here, that the Father is seeking people. It's because God seeks us out that we worship him. And then the third thing is that it's really easy when we encounter Jesus to try and deflect, but Jesus will always turn it right back around. Look what he says. The woman says, I know that the Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will declare all things to us. So she says, all right, I had this tertiary issue that I'm using as a way to not get to the heart of the issue. And Jesus says, no, location doesn't matter. Those preferences aren't what really matters. Worshiping in spirit and truth is what matters. And when presented with that, that's a choice for her to say, okay, I'm going to follow God and I'm going to worship in spirit and truth. She has a choice there. She can agree and she can follow God and understand what Jesus is saying, but instead she kind of deflects. She says, well, I don't really want to have to deal with that now. Let's talk about that later. One day the Messiah will get here. He'll explain all that to us. We don't need to worry about that right now. But Jesus says, no. Like, I'm here. I'm the Messiah. I'm right now here telling you the answer. We don't need to wait for a future event. This isn't about one day figuring it out, but starting with Jesus, what has changed? And so as we wrap up today, as we start to bring it to a close, we need to ask what we do with this. Like, how can we take this and do something with it? If worship is the activity, not just knowing a bunch of stuff about who God is, well, what activity can we do? This week at our practice for the music team on Thursday night, in preparation for this, I asked the whole team, I asked them, what are some ways that you've been able to worship God this week that are not through music? What are some ways that you've been able to worship in other parts of your life? And we talked about things like seeing something beautiful in nature, like the giant supermoon that we had, or being up in the mountains and seeing the majesty and glory of what God has made just brings us to praise him. We talked about spending time in prayer, spending time in Bible reading, but that's a question I would ask you as well. Throughout the week, what are some ways that you have found that you can worship God? And if you can't really think of any examples, that might be a problem, because I think a lot of people treat Sunday morning as the be-all, end-all of church, right? Church is the thing I go to on Sunday morning for an hour, and then I go through the rest of my life. But I have to say that's not church. Obviously, this is a part of what church is, but church is not this building. Church is not this sermon. Church is not the music we sing. Church, the church, is so much more than that. It's you and it's me in our lives and in our community throughout the week. And so the example that we've used often, if you're treating the church service on a Sunday morning like a restaurant where you're going to come get a meal on Sunday morning and then that's it for the week. Think of how hungry you're going to be by next Sunday. Instead, it's important to think of this service today and this time that we have on a Sunday morning as a cooking school where you're going to learn some things that you can do to feed yourself throughout the week and then turn around and help to feed others. And so, on your own, what can you do with that? And the second thing to think about is how can we worship God as a community? And again, we're doing some of that right now. We've got time together where we're all singing. There's something powerful about bringing a lot of people together and just singing and praising Him. But what else can we do as a community throughout the week, throughout our lives? And then the final thing I'll ask is, what kind of tertiary things are you maybe caught up on? What type of secondary issues are holding you back from unity and true worship of God, both on a Sunday morning and throughout the week? As we get ready to close today, I'm going to put the offering slide up today. Normally we do that right now. We normally do this during our offering time, but we're all going to sing together during the offering time. So I'm going to put that up, and I'm going to pray as we close. But I think if we can kind of get this, like think about how much it can change our own lives. Think about how much it will change the way we live if we are spending every minute worshiping God in all these different ways. Think of what an example that sets to those outside of the church, how different you'll look as you worship Him. So I'm going to pray. I'm going to invite the worship team up, and then we're going to stand and we're going to sing together. God, we thank you again that we get to worship you. We thank you that you've given us this ability, that you seek out us to worship in spirit and truth, and we just thank you. Please be with us as we go in our lives, as we go about our days, as we have this holiday weekend. Help us just to find ways to worship and praise you in unexpected ways. In your name, amen.